Hi friends, I'm Red Stegall. I'm an entertainer, author, and proud Texas rancher. I'm inviting my fellow cattle ranchers to join me in the Alamo statewide Stampede, a simple way to help preserve our Texas heritage. When you sell your livestock, just let the auction house know you'd like some or all of the proceeds to go to the Remember the Alamo Foundation. If you don't have livestock, no problem. You can still take part by making a donation. These tax-deductible donations will go directly to the Alamo Plan, which is preserving the Alamo for generations to come. And together we'll ensure we always remember the Alamo.
Stories Bigger Than Texas, the Alamo Podcast. By May 1836, the news of Texas independence has spread, and the Alamo will once again change hands. Today, we reveal the Mexican Army's final days at the Alamo, the orders sent from on high to tear down reinforcements, and the literal fire left behind inside the Alamo Church. I'm your host, Emily Balcom. Today, we are joined by Kolby Lanham, the Alamo senior researcher and historian. Thank you for being here, Kolby.
Happy to be back.
Kolby, take us back 189 years ago this week to May 19th, 1836. About 1,000 soldiers from the Mexican Army had been here since March 6th, about 2.5 months ago. But on May 19th, that all starts to change. What happens?
Yeah, so to talk about that, we'll go back just a little bit, and we can talk about how the battle ends, and then Santa Anna will actually leave a portion of the army here, and he'll go join the majority of his troops that marched eastward, and he'll appoint a general named Juan Jose Andrade, a very competent commander. He leaves him behind to take command of not only the Alamo, but also of Bejar. He'll leave behind with Andrade more than 1,000 men, and his primary task is going to be to rebuild the fortifications so the town could be defended against a possible Texian attack, something similar to what happened on March 6th. His secondary task will be to care for the 150 Mexican soldiers who had been wounded in the battle, along with another 40 men who had fallen ill during that time. Andrade immediately realizes the situation is pretty dire, and he makes note that he's only been left with $5,000 to provide for all of those tasks. And then he talks about 20 men left to take care of the people in the hospital. So he's in a pretty bad situation. You know, the Mexican Army wins the Battle of the Alamo, but then there's the mess afterwards. And Santana is in a hurry to try to chase down the remainder of the Texian Army under Houston and try to capture the cabinet, the newly formed Texas government. And so he kind of just leaves his men behind, and Andrade turns, you have to imagine him turning around and seeing the mess. And they got to pick up the pieces. Like I said, even though they're victorious, it's kind of a precarious situation they find themselves in. Also, at the same time, he's going to get word that Santana is going to meet up with Sam Houston, just like Santana wanted to, and then Houston's going to capture Santana. And that puts him in even more of a precarious situation. And this is where I make note of the fog of war. The fog of war, that term made famous by a German general named Clausewitz, people think that it talks about war in general, but what it really is talking about is the fog of war after combat operations have ceased or after a primary engagement with the enemy. That fog of war, everyone's heightened, their senses are heightened, you've just lost a bunch of men, your supplies might be a calamity, basically just spread out all over the place. And the fog of war sets in, and people can't really communicate properly. It happens even today with modern communication. Imagine, letters taking weeks to get to places and everything else. And so the fog of war sets in, but a general steps in who's tapped to be second in charge, General Filisola. And Filisola, though he never really commanded any decisive battles during the Revolution, he did have a lot of success under a previous president, and he was well respected. He was trailing Santa Anna and trying to catch up with him, but that actually doesn't play out because Santa Anna is captured in the meantime. So what does Filisola do? Filisola is instructed to wait for his men to gather together. He was supposed to reinforce Santana. We know that. That doesn't take place. And so he's left somewhere between San Felipe and Fort Bend with about 1,000 men. And when he gets word of Santana's capture on the 21st of April, 1836, he's got a decision to make. Do I go and try to free Santana? Do I even know he's alive? Do I risk going into another engagement with the Texans and being defeated? The news is spreading about Santana's capture, and it actually demoralizes his men. So Filisola has a full plate, and it kind of leaves Andrade here in San Antonio with a bunch of questions.
Like a what now? What do we do?
Seriously, a what now? What's the next steps? And so when news reaches Bejar on May 6th that Santana has been captured, Filisola really didn't have any knowledge to give to Andrade, so Andrade's waiting.
He gets his answers May 19th.
He does. So he gets his answers on May 19th. Those orders are to start tearing part of the Alamo down. and taking apart portions of the fortifications, taking care of the artillery, the projectiles, and the powder that goes with it, and then vacating this area to meet up with the bulk of the army that's in the neighborhood of La Bahia or Goliad.
I can only imagine the shape the Alamo was in after the battle, and the soldiers left behind had been told, fix it, refortify it. So what did they do?
Andrade initially writes to a comrade of his named Urrea, who's at La Bahia. And he says almost immediately, I know nothing of our situation. And the campaign, where it sits now, has covered the army in shame. And he's a very proud individual, and he sets about trying to follow the orders that are given to him by Filisola, but there are some politics going on in the background. Filisola was chosen to be second in charge because he was very good friends with Santa Anna. He's a Santanista, whereas Andrade and Urrea are not. They didn't have a lot of confidence in their supreme commander. And so now that he's gone, they really don't trust Filisola all that much. And so Andrade takes the news that he got, but he also writes another individual named Tornel in Mexico and tells him, basically, this is what's really happening in Texas. You're being told one thing. Here's what's really taking place. And he says a couple things, and I'll read this here. He says, Your Eminence, with the unfortunate fate of the army in these matters, we are unable to endure for long fatigue beyond human effort. The chief officers had not received pay for 2 months, and the troops have received only half a day for the previous month. He's basically telling them, hey, you're being told this thing, and it's actually not taking place, and we're in dire straits. He goes about trying to tear parts of the Alamo down. We know that's happening. He also has the men under his command who are in poor shape, and that's kind of where they leave him sitting.
Some don't have shoes. They're down to one meal a day.
He says to Tornel in that same letter, there is limited clothing for the soldiers, some without footwear, some without enough rations, except for the same miserable meat, cornbread, that we eat all the time. Still, he states that his troops in Behar remain loyal and not demoralized.
There's a doctor named Joseph H. Barnard here, and he writes down what he sees. So what did he see, and how did he get to be at the Alamo?
Barnard is actually going to be under the command at La Bahia underneath James Walker Fannin. Of course, James Walker Fannin meets a similar fate to those at the Alamo. Him and his men are massacred. At the Alamo, they killed everybody. It was an intense battle. It was in the morning hours. They even went into the hospital, and they killed Dr. Amos Pollard and the wards who were inside that hospital. After the battle, they realized they have a lot of people laying around with grievous wounds. We have no doctors. At least they didn't have enough doctors. And so at La Bahia, when they rounded everyone up and marched them out, they left the nurses or the wards and the doctors and they spared them. And it's going to be 2 different doctors who are spared, and one of them is going to be Barnard. And he talks about being brought to San Antonio as a prisoner. He's housed and taken care of. They accommodate for him. And he says that we have 2 colonels and a major and 8 captains under our charge. That's important to note, that you have a lot of men who are in poor shape, but they're talking about specifically the officers. And you see that throughout. The officers are taken care of, and then the lower echelon soldiers are taken care of. Same thing happened at the Alamo. Whenever they were burying the Mexican dead, the Mexican lower echelon, they got all buried in 2 mass graves. The Mexican soldiers got a proper burial with burial rites and a coffin. And so the officers are being taken care of first, and Bernard talks about that. Andrade says to Tornel that the wounded after the Alamo are still laying around after 2 months in the hospitals due to the absolute lack of medicine. And despite having requested it a month and a half ago from the Commander General in Matamoros, nothing has arrived and I have received no answer. 2 foreign physicians who remain prisoners who have been quite successful until now, and it is likely they would have saved more men if medicine had been available. And so even Andrade realizes that these Texans who were enemies just a month earlier are trying to help, but they are in the same position. They have no medicine.
The doctor explains what's happening. He talks about how busy the Mexican army is trying to take down what they had built back up.
Once Andrade gets the letter from Filisola, he does as he was told to do. Starts tearing down portions of the Alamo. This is ironic to me, as a historian, when you look at the whole conflict of the revolution, it was the Mexican army who built up the fortifications of the Alamo. The Texans took it in December of 1835, and then the Mexican army stormed it, destroyed their own fortifications they'd already built, and then now they're having to rebuild it a second time. And Andrade talks about this work that's happening. Bernard says that they're busy as bees tearing down portions of the Alamo, but Andrade also says that his men are threadbare. They're almost naked. And, they're, like I said, they're eating one meal a day. And so this work had to have been arduous, tearing down these fortifications and walls.
So as you said, they built it up. They took it down during battle. They built it back up, and now they're taking it down.
Yeah.
It's really amazing to think how much history was lost, things today that we would love to have seen. Are there records of what exactly they rebuilt and took down?
No, not precisely, at least not that I'm aware of. But what we can surmise is that they're probably focusing on areas that saw a lot of the battle on March 6th. And we know that a lot of that took place on the North Wall because it was in a dilapidated or worn out shape. So you can imagine they're probably bolstering the North Wall, working on the outer fortifications, and then likely repairing roofs of some of the buildings which had caught fire during the battle.
There was an order to throw some weapons in the river. Was that carried out?
This is an interesting question, which we've talked about in other parts of the podcast. And the letter comes in from Filisola and basically gives Andrade the option of taking care of the artillery and how to do it. He tells him to spike it and make it inoperable, make it where it can't fire. And then he talks about throwing the projectiles and the gunpowder or whatever in the San Antonio River. Some other sources talk about that Filisola ordered him to throw the cannons in the river. So it's not quite clear, but what we do know is that the cannons have been recovered and they were within the walls of the fort. So we know that those didn't go in the river. But on the site itself, we have not found large caches of artillery or projectiles, I should say, or powder. And that makes me think that some of that was taken with Andrade whenever he left, because he did take a couple cannons with him whenever he left the Alamo.
And remind us, over the years, have we ever found any evidence of weapons or projectiles, anything left behind in the San Antonio River?
So we have not been successful in the recent history of being able to recover anything from the river, because after the major floods in San Antonio and then the River Authority is developed, the river is concrete lined now. And there have been many people, even probably before I was born, who worked really hard to try to get the city of San Antonio to drain that river, to fix that area and take out any artillery that might be there. We have a good idea of where it might be. But if you go back further in the record, Samuel Maverick, one of the mayors of San Antonio and a Texas revolutionary who we've talked about on the podcast before, he says that his son swam down and they could feel cannons with their feet and hands. And we think those are from the Battle of Behar that General Cos had shoved into the river. And so there are at least 8 or 9 cannons in the river, but I think the majority of the ones from the Battle of the Alamo, they're going to be buried within the fort walls.
So this whole plan to destroy everything and move out, there's kind of a problem with it. There are Mexican soldiers at the Alamo who are sick or wounded. Some of them have been in bad shape since March 6th. So what happens to them?
They're going to be left behind. The Mexican army says that they leave behind money to take care of those sick or wounded or even dying. And he talks about preparing for their funerals. He also says that the ones that were left behind were unable to endure the hard overland trip to Matamoros. Transporting them would cause more pain and discomfort than one's own wounds.
No amputations had been performed since the battle. Some still had musket balls inside their bodies.
Yeah, you think that Bernard, whenever he comes in with the other doctor, that they're going to be able to help. It's not enough to just have the skills and know-how. You have to have the instruments and you have to have the supplies to do that. And it's just lacking.
It takes a few days to get this whole thing done. And Dr. Bernard wrote down what happened when the troops left town on May 24th. Quote, "A large fire streamed up from the Alamo." Tell us about that fire.
Yes, Dr. Bernard says that he watches the Mexican army file out of town, him and some other men. I think he says he goes with the alcalde. They go up to the fort to see what state they left the Alamo in. And he says, "We found a fire to proceed from a church where a platform had been built, extending from the great door to the top of the wall on the back side, for the purpose of taking up the artillery to the top of the church. That was made with wood and was far too consumed by fire to extinguish it." So they're talking about the ramp that was made by the Mexican army to fire cannons out of the back of the church, or what we would call the shrine today.
He writes, "The walls of the church, being built of solid masonry, of course, could not be but little injured by the fire. The Alamo was completely dismantled. All the single walls were leveled." So let's break this apart. He's talking about the Alamo as a complex being dismantled, but that the walls of the church are okay?
Yeah, he's saying basically that the single walls have been pulled down, but the Alamo walls are still standing as far as the Alamo Church. But then the outer perimeter walls have been mostly torn apart by the Mexican army.
After hearing all this, Kolby, it's a miracle we have what we have today of the Alamo Church in Long Bear, collectively the Shrine of Texas Liberty.
Yeah, there's no doubt about that. I mean, the Mexican army, if you ask the lower echelon or even some of the men like Andrade, they may say that the Battle of the Alamo was costly in men and supplies. But when you talk to Santana, he says it was such a small affair. But if that's the case, then why are they being ordered to tear down the fort? It's because no one wants to fight another battle like that. It was a nasty ordeal for both sides. And so tearing down those walls means that they can keep from having a second Alamo. The fact that we have any of it today is nothing short of a miracle. And that's thanks to the Daughters of the Republic of Texas, the state of Texas, the city of San Antonio. All of those organizations band together. And I should also mention the U.S. Army, who were here for quite some time, who helped to save the Alamo.
Did a lot of work to preserve the Alamo. That's
right.
For sure. All those groups collectively. And when we think back to this fire in the wake of the Mexican army leaving, it's easy to think about it from a modern day perspective with the church church roof, but you have to think about that roof wasn't there down the middle. There was just that cannon ramp. Clearly, it was not as destructive as it would have been today.
Yeah, I think so. And I was wondering when I was reading this is, the Mexican army probably would have pulled the church down if they had the ability. But you imagine the undertaking of pulling down, 20-foot tall walls, and then also they're 2 to 5 foot thick. It's a huge undertaking. That's why the smaller walls are all pulled down.
So when the Mexican army leaves town May 24th, we do have some writing left behind from both a Texas perspective and a Mexican perspective. What can we learn from it?
Yeah, Dr. Bernard says the Mexican army troops are now leaving town. The last column is at this moment crossing the river. And then General Andrade writes, he's basically saying that he's worried about what critics are going to say about this, stain on the Mexican army and their record in Texas. But he does say something that's interesting. He says the calm hand of labor existed as the garrison vacated Bihar. At no time ever did I move or act in haste in order to say that I was not retreating, nor was there a flight of my troops. He wants his retreat to be dignified, and he wants to be able to hold his head high. This is important because when Filisola goes back to Mexico, he's tried for treason, and that's basically a punishable death, and I should say he's basically court-martialed. And he ends up defending himself and nothing happens to him, but this is a very real deal. You follow the orders of the person above you and you can find yourself in serious hot water. So he's trying to dignify a dignified retreat and act as an officer should act.
And the Texas doctor writes some final thoughts in his journal.
Yeah, so Dr. Bernard talks about in his journal that he's looking at the Alamo and he said that the men who died at the Alamo fell as those heroes of old Thermopylae did. And so almost immediately we know that by the end of March and even afterwards, people are talking about the old 300 under King Leonidas and likening the Alamo defenders to the men of Thermopylae, a very famous battle in history. He also says that defenders should look down and take pleasure in seeing their enemies retreating ignominiously from the country they entered with such bravado, meaning that they're leaving with their heads hung low. And he specifically mentions Bowie and Travis would be proud of that. They sold their lives dearly, and this is the end result.
What can we take away from the Mexican army's final days at the Alamo?
As I said earlier, the fog of war has set in, and the men, because of lack of communication, kind of the same issue that Travis found himself in with not getting his letters out in time or having enough time for people to respond. Andrade's kind of in the same position. He goes weeks without any type of letter giving him direction. It's because the Mexican government is in disarray. I think what I read at the end of all of that was very interesting is that a Lieutenant Francisco Castaneda is left behind by Andrade. And he says he's an officer with the local Alamo company, and he remained behind with 18 soldiers with orders to receive the Texans and turn the town over and its public property to them. And on June 4th, 1836, that happens when a captain, Juan Seguin, arrived with 22 men to reclaim Bihar. After a brief meeting, Castaneda relinquished control of the town to Seguin, and he and his men departed for Matamoros. It's important to bring up Castaneda because Castaneda was here at the very beginning with the Come and Take It cannon. He was sent out with 100 dragoons to take the cannon back from the people of Gonzales, and that's come full circle, and now he's the last of the Mexican soldiers to leave the Alamo at the end of the revolution.
Full circle.
Yeah, full circle.
Kolby Lanham, thank you so much for joining us.
You're welcome.
Be sure to check out the podcast notes. We've linked to 2 essays written by the Alamo's former curator, Dr. Bruce Winders, where you can read a bit more about this time period and the condition of the Alamo Church during the Republic of Texas era. You've been listening to Stories Bigger Than Texas, the Alamo Podcast.